So before the break, we were looking at, the particular case of antibiotics within the context of AMR and seeing the extent to which what's being proposed in the current new version of the Commission's proposal for the pharmaceutical legislation, is it fit for purpose, given the specific context and some of the challenges around antimicrobial resistance and antibiotics? In this second session, we're going to focus in on the issue of pricing, because there is a very clear political objective to make sure we pay fair prices for the medicines so that we can use them in a sustainable way. So we heard also in the previous session the importance of having data and sharing of that. In this one, we're going to try and understand the transparency of R&D costs, because it's a bit like a black box. At the end, we're told, here's the cost and here's the price, but we need to break it down, particularly to be able to see where can we create efficiencies, where can we avoid duplications, what else could be done to make this work well. So as with the previous panel, we will have a short presentation which gives us the context and some real content, and then our panelists will take it forward. So you also will have access to the PowerPoints as with the previous session, but let me just, excuse me, turn the page. And I invite us to understand that the first presentation that we're going to have is going to be made by, let me build up the key messages here. Anne, please come ahead. Go ahead. It's not on my piece of paper. Anne Hendricks is the advisor in the research department of Solidaris. The clicker is here. Okay.
I will raise I'll try to address the question of can we have fair prices for medicines if we don't have transparency on R&D cost? And I really had some very interesting slides showing you my starting point, because luckily we had a very recent, very interesting, thank you. And I need a clicker. You will do it. Okay, next slide, please. I can't do it? No. Okay. So very interesting research that was led by Gug and myself, actually, in the scope of Ascertain, a Horizon project, where we looked at the existing definition of fair prices. Because we believe that, first of all, if we want to get fair prices, at least we should know what we all mean by fair prices. And one very interesting finding in that research was that we had four main topics in the definition of fair prices: affordability, cost, profit, and value, and that all stakeholders, except one, the pharmaceutical industry, mentioned cost as a key element to the fair prices. So if we dig a bit into the definitions that are given by different actors and that we found in that research, we can clearly identify the R&D cost as a key element of the cost. Eurordis really mentions this very, very specifically. The WHO definition of fair prices that came out of the Fair Pricing Forum in 2019, no, not yet, doesn't seem to be that direct about R&D costs, but you will see later that actually it is. European Cancer League also had a very interesting definition of fair prices, including R&D. And AIM took over the WHO definition. So if we look a bit now at how to calculate those fair prices, WHO gave very interesting insight on how they would see those fair prices. There were a series of articles following that definition in the BMG. And in those articles, you can see that the components of the fair prices are very clear, and they clearly include R&D cost as a major element. One very interesting point in there is that they also address the feasibility of calculating those prices, and the only one that really seemed to be problematic to them is the R&D cost. To go a bit further in this debate, at AIM, we decided to try to create a full model, something with parameters that would allow us to have complete data and to get to a final. No, can you come back, please? Because we miss a bit. It's okay. So we created at AIM level an algorithm, including all the elements that are taken in this research and that compose the cost elements of a drug, but also add some value element in the innovation bonus. And we filled in all these parameters with data that we consider are relevant. And for almost all parameters, we can find something that is quite straightforward. For the production cost, we can either go for transparent cost and real cost, and it's not really that difficult to estimate how much one specific drug would cost. But if we have problems with that, we can use with we can work with lump sums, and these lump sums are also quite straightforward to address. Okay, it's clearly there are different kind of drugs, different kind of population, but we can find quite easily in the literature how to define them. For sales and medical information, for basic profit also, it's not that difficult to find some parameters. Same goes for the value. Of course, there will be a lot of discussion of what is relevant value for a drug, what kind of elements do we need to make sure that we push the companies to develop the proper drugs. But these all elements are still quite simple to decide. On the R&D aspects, it's much more complicated because in the AM model, we start with transparency, considering that we could have transparency on R&D drugs, and then we put a cap on the research because, of course, I mean, a real cost plus system would increase even more than today the cost, so that's really not what we are aiming for. But if you look at this even transparent element, you can see that there are some very, very difficult trade-offs to be made. One example that I'm giving here is the Biot case. We all know for sofosbuvir that Gilead purchased Pharmasets, okay, company that only developed one drug. They spent 271 million in research, which is, okay, transparent. But Gilead paid 11 billion to purchase that company. So what is this 11 billion? Is that R&D? Is that an investment of Gilead in assets, brains, whatever? This kind of debate we need to address, but we only can address them if we have transparency, because if you see 11 billion in Gilead's accounts, you have to consider them as research if you don't have further transparency. So this is a difficult parameter that we need to discuss, but clearly for us, we need transparency in order to be able to have it. In AIM's model, we didn't want to be captive of that transparency, so we decided to go for lump sum, the same as for production cost. And we wanted this lump sum to be incentivizing for the companies to give us transparency. So we've put them quite tightened. So the lump sum we give for the development of one new drug, one new indication is 250 million. The question is that enough? If you take an example of, again, that Sovaldi drug that we have put in our calculator. If you're interested, you have the link to the fair pricing calculator. You will see it's a very interesting tool to play with. If we look at the real cost of R&D for sofosbuvir, in the literature, you can find that in addition to this 271 million from Pharmaset, there was some major investment from Gilead. In total, they spent 800 million in R&D. We use that R&D cost divided by the patient population, add production cost and all the other costs, and we come to a fair price of 900 euro for the treatment with an hepatitis C drug like Sovaldi, which we all paid more or less 40,000 initially, just to give you an idea. But if we go now to the system of lump sum, because we have no transparency, we will apply our lump sum of 250 million. And in that case, the price per treatment would be 435 euros. So we would divide our price by 2 if we don't have transparency. So this is maybe a bit extreme. This example is maybe a bit extreme, but it really shows, I believe, the fact that if we want to discuss about R&D, we have to have transparency, because or 250 million lump sum clearly is not enough to cover the cost for all new medicines. But can we give more than 250 million? That's a lot of money. If we have no justification, no transparency, if we know nothing about what's in it, I mean, more than 250 million would never be fair towards the health systems and the patients. And if we get some transparency on public money, okay, that's good. Okay, more transparency is always good. We all agree on that. But what do we do with that? Because, okay, you know that that company got, I don't know, 100 million public money for research. But how much did they pay? I mean, is that 10%? Is that 50%? Is that 90% of their investment? What this kind of information could really lead you to mistaken choices, saying, okay, is that better if you had public investors, or is that worse? We really can do nothing with just the public money transparency. And my point, and we will discuss that now, is that really I believe that transparency on total R&D cost is a real prerequisite for fair prices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Come and join on the panel. That was a really fascinating overview of what's clearly a very complex process, but what you've managed to do is sort of make it into something that feels very simple. Please come and join me, members of the panel. I'll introduce you. So I have with me Anne Prokopkova from the Greens, a health policy advisor, the Greens EFA group at the European Parliament. You already asked a question before the break. Thank you. I have Dr. Javier de la Cueva, correctly pronounced, I hope, who is a lawyer specialized in free intellectual property licenses. We'll be sharing some of his experience. And I have Susanna Chapman, a health policy analyst in the health division and the director for employment and labor and social affairs at the OECD. So we have a great panel who'll help us open in on that. And Anne, you highlighted the way that you engage with the industry to sort of incentivize them to share more information, in the sense that, well, we can't take into account everything you spent unless we know how much you spent, and then we can use that as a basis for a more appropriate conversation. I'm going to start with Susanna, because before the break, we talked about how this has become such a huge political momentum at EU level. The EU member states are significantly interested in addressing this and picking up on this issue. And I'm wondering if this is similar across the OECD countries. But let me start by you. At the OECD, you developed a very comprehensive set of indicators to monitor pharmaceutical industry performance. And of course, that's something the EU is also concerned about, is competitiveness of its own industry. And that was to better support these debates in pharmaceutical policies that take place. Can you tell us more what the OECD has been doing about this, and how these indicators are a contribution to this conversation about transparency on R&D spend?
Yes, of course. I think this is working okay. So thank you, of course, for inviting me to speak in this very interesting panel with a great selection of speakers. So I'm delighted to share, some of OECD's work in this space. We've been working in transparency across a number of different areas. And so today, what I'll be talking about is as Tamsin mentioned, this work on industry performance and looking at transparency of the industry as a whole globally. It's a very complex picture, if I can say that. So what we did is a feasibility study to try and develop a comprehensive set of indicators to better understand and monitor the performance of the industry, to be able to better support these policy debates. And really the motivation for this came out of all of these conflicting narratives that are coming from the public side, from the private side, about what's happening, where is funding going, how is it developing into outputs, innovativeness of medicines, etc. And there's really this lack of health policy focused, commonly accepted, what we call facts. And so the OECD is trying to fill this gap in this area. So in terms of how do we do this, and what do we mean by industry performance? So industry performance in our work is looking at the ability of the pharmaceutical industry to allocate resources to desirable activities and produce effective medicines that are meeting patient needs. and they have three different components. So we have a framework in the paper that was published in August this year, where we look at inputs, so what's coming in financially. We're talking about revenue, R&D subsidies, tax credits, etc. Activities, so where is this money, well, what is it being used for? For example, in R&D expenditure, clinical, on the financial side, and then you have the non-financial side, so into clinical trials and product development, etc. And then, of course, the outputs, which Anne mentioned before, which is, about the clinical benefit, the innovativeness, etc. of medicines. So in terms of the project that we've done, so we've assessed the availability and the utility of 11 different data sources for the first two aspects, so the inputs and the activity. So using a variety of these different databases, some of which are held by OECD, some are purchase data sets, clinical trial data from the WHO, prescription sales, etc. And what the work was able to show was it was able to confirm the feasibility of being able to generate some input and activity indicators, but also highlight really the need for careful analysis and interpretation. So if you look at an aggregate point in terms of the initial results, R&D expenditure and activity has increased globally, and profitability reduced, but really it's the significant heterogeneity that's happening across the types and the sizes of firms that makes these aggregates not representative. And in general, we found that some of these aggregates have really been driven by a small number of larger and profitable firms. So when we're talking about the different aggregates, I'm not going to go into each of the indicators, there's many of them. But basically the idea that there's a need to consider these different types of firms, the structure, the financing, the incentives, etc., of what is a very diverse industry. In terms of the report, I won't give you too many numbers. One of the ones that came out from the initial outputs was about across the limited data that we have in 26 OECD countries, the pharma industry received about 10% of total R&D expenditure externally. So we're talking about domestic funding from governments, higher education and nonprofit, etc. But of course, we don't have the full picture. So this is a very, it could be overestimated, it could be underestimated. And that also in aggregate R&D accounted for about 40 to 50% of total revenue. In terms of the policy implications, so I think, having these authoritative data on industry activities, risks, costs, the use of public funding, where it's going, could generate meaningful evidence to inform policy. We're not there yet. We're trying to kind of harmonize and create these facts that I was talking about. But of course, the complexity really makes this very difficult. And so in terms of the way forward, we're thinking about how can we disaggregate a little bit more, segment analysis, look into really what is sort of happening underneath there. And then the other side of things is really the outputs point. So we've been talking about inputs and activities and what's happening. But what we're really interested in is, are we producing drugs that are providing clinical benefit for patients? And, if we're talking about public funding, where is that public funding going? And at the moment, the picture is very complex. So yeah, we're really trying to inform the policy debate by increasing the transparency, but there is still a ways to go.
Thank you very much. You threw out a few figures in there, and I just want to make sure I've understood that. Across 26 OECD countries where you had data, it looked like 10% of the sort of inputs were coming from external sources, whether they were public or philanthropic or charities or universities, etc. So 10% going in. And then you mentioned something about that was that 40% of research and development revenue?
Yes,
okay,
in
so
aggregate.
That 10% actually is going straight into research and development, which is, I guess, what you'd want it to go into. And it's working out as the equivalent of 40%. So there's a sort of amplifier effect. 10% of the money that's going in is coming externally, but it's being used to best effect towards research and innovation. Is that correct?
I think it's a little bit more a little bit more nuanced than that. So the sort of the linkages between the inputs and activities is a little bit murky. So we can't really say this or this. We can kind of say at the moment, okay, the inputs are this, the activities are this, but really we need to do more work to understand where the flows are going from and coming from. But I think, you know, these estimates are also based on what we have available. And a lot of that in that number of the 10% is driven by the US as well. So,
So in our incredibly data-rich world, we're having difficulty getting the data we need to understand the situation. It's kind of ironic that we are in such a data-driven environment. Okay, Javier, let me come to you because you're both a lawyer and a member of the board of directors of Fundación Ciudadana Civil, and you actually take court cases. You litigate for public sector transparency. This is your passion, your commitment.
Yes.
And you have successfully obtained 2 rulings that are positive for transparency in medicine prices in Spain. Tell us about this. Tell us about the approach that you used to challenge the Spanish administration on this issue of access to medicines.
Okay, I would like to speak a little bit more broader, in a broader sense, because what we are always speaking about is about open science. That's the main issue that we are speaking about in this hall. Okay, so transparency is always about open science.
Microphone closer to your mouth.
So what we have to do is we have to produce a better research and development system, and that is open science. So that's a UNESCO recommendation from 2021, because we do have a huge problem in science. So that's the first point that I would like to say. And that problem in science that we do have is tailored by the absence of relevant data. We do not have data. And the data that we do have is made by a narrative that I also deal with criminal cases, and I say that there are 2 kinds of criminals, the ones who use the criminal code and the ones who use the official journals. And in this case, what we are dealing is sometimes with people who, what they could enter into the criminal concept. Why? Because what they are doing is they don't take care. They don't have any kind of problem to poison us if they do get a profit. And that's not the problem. That is their business. So we do have an absence of data, and that absence of data goes directly into our environment and directly into our common good. And that is criminal. That's it, full stop. Okay, so that's my first point. And that uses certain tools. The first tool is the absence of data. And the second tool is the intellectual property in order to produce absence of data. Oh no, this is my intellectual property. That is my trade competition system where I'm going to obtain my profit. And if I do have intellectual property, then you cannot touch it because it is sacred. No, excuse me, my health or the health of humankind is sacred. What do we do in Fundación Ciudadana Civil? Fundación Ciudadana Civil, what we push is for transparency. So we do have several lines of actions. And one of the lines of actions is Medicamentalia, who has international awards because we have compared the prices of drugs all around the world. And now what we are doing is we are trying to arrive to how does Spanish public administration reach the point to say, well, we're going to pay this money for this drug. So they don't want to tell us. So the government is the one who we are battling, and the government is with the industry, and they don't want to give us the clue. How did you reach that conclusion for that price? And then, well, we go to court. We make a freedom of information petition, and this freedom of information petition in 3 drugs has been denied. It doesn't matter what kind of color the government is. It doesn't matter if it's conservative or if it's socialist. It's exactly the same. You know, they are always in the same packet. When there is a law related to intellectual property, that's the only law that they always vote together. In all the others, they are opposite, but in these ones, they vote together. Well, piracy, you know, piracy is going to destroy creativity. So the thing is that what we find is that, okay, let's go to court. And in the 2 cases, one was Gilead, and well, what we found there is the same strategy of the different companies. They don't want to give any sort of information. Why? It's not that I don't want to give you information. It is that as happens with nuclear bombs, it's not that you are not going to know how to make nuclear bombs. It is that you're not going to have the knowledge in order to one day arrive to the knowledge to do nuclear bombs. So where do we cut the knowledge? And they decide to cut the knowledge as most as possible. So there's no data, no clue, nothing at all, no parameters, no rationality, nothing. The two resolutions has said, yes, you have to give the data. The problem is that we are in the first instance, and they, of course, have appealed. I have already answered one of the appeals, and the other answer of the appeal is the deadline is the 17th of January. So we're just in the middle of the battle. And this is going to reach the Supreme Court in Spain. Of course, it's going to reach. What is the tension of the rights that we do have here? First, public interest. There is public interest on how the agreements are made. And second, this public interest, the arguments that they do have, if it was applied to all the state agreements, then everything would be secret. A train, a road, a street, any kind of material would be absolutely secret, because the argumentation that they are producing is that, no, they need that, because if not, the drug is going to rise their price. And we say, well, you've got that already in the United States. We don't want that in Spain. So that argumentation is not really very good one. But the second is that they include in the rule, in the proceedings, first of all, very, very, very long writings. So we're speaking about 100, 150 pages writing. So then they try to exhaust you with this tactics of, but well, we are methodic and we read it absolutely everything. We read till the last comma, and we analyze all of the different scientific reference that they bring. And of course, all those scientific reference are their reference. They are made by the industry, but they try to tailor them as they are not from the industry. So again, they have a narrative that's a cheated narrative. So the two rulings, what are they important? Yes, they are, because they are showing a way. They are not definitive yet. They are not very strong in the argumentation, because they are a first ruling, and first ruling judges are always just saying quick, I've got no time, so do it quickly. But we are reserving our argumentations for the second level of appeal, and of course this is going to reach the Supreme Court. We believe that in 4 or 5 years we will have the final rulings, and we expect that the tension between the public interest and the private interesting will be solved in forcing it into public interest. There's also another, and I end with this, there's also another interesting parameter here, is that they refer to certain decisions from or recommendations from the European Commission saying that, oh, we have to hide the prices, especially with COVID, because if not, we're not going to be able to develop solutions. And well, what we bring is the opinions of the Council of Europe and on the World Health Organization that say the opposite. And we also argument that don't bring the Commission, the European Commission opinion here, because it's irrelevant. You have already the Spanish government opinion here, and that is also irrelevant. That is what we are battling: the European Commission opinion that we have here, and the Spanish government recommendation that we have here. And we have to disclose this information, because we need this in order to produce a better health system.
Thank you very much. You are very clearly passionate about this, and I love that. We tend to have very short timeframes in Brussels. We think 6 months at a time, and I just love the fact that it's going to the Supreme Court. 4 to 5 years, I'll be ready. I've got my arguments ready. That's long-term planning, and thank you for that. Anna, let me bring you back to Brussels and its cycles of legislation. What is currently being done at EU level? I'm particularly interested to see if you can help us understand the interplay between the new pharma legislation package, which of course is that big once-in-a-generation opportunity to update our approach to pharmaceuticals, and the EU HTA regulation, which enters into force in just over a year, January 2025, which is also a tool to help member states understand the added value scientifically and clinically of a particular medicine, which will be an input in these secret negotiations and pricing tools. So help us to understand what's the European level in this.
So hello, and thank you for having me on this panel. So I maybe start just commenting on what you just said on the timelines, and you're absolutely right. We are thinking the pharma legislation is going to be negotiated tomorrow and voted next month. It's 420 articles, over 300 recitals, long annexes. we will be extremely lucky if we have it close in 10 years. And you know, and you mentioned HTA. I mean, just the council position took 3 years, and then the trilogues then were fairly fast. Well, it was only 49 extremely painful technical trilogues that I remember, but we got there. But yeah, like I have to always start this debate on pricing with a disclaimer that, of course, it's a member state competence. So now that I've like ticked this off, I can actually focus on how the EU is affecting this, because I don't actually believe it's only member state competence. I think we have plenty to do where we can help affordability and actually achieving of fair pricing down the line in member states. So when you're thinking about, there's different pricing models, and personally, I could subscribe to something like unpresented, because of course, like the cost-based pricing models, they are quite logical. There's all of these components, and we create some sort of equation, and it all makes sense at the end of the day. But of course, in order to achieve this and unstressed it very well, we do need transparency. Without transparency, this cost-based model is very flawed. So we do need to work on that, and how, for instance, the pharmaceutical legislation affects this. So already the Commission in the directive has this famous Article 57, where we have now demanding companies to at least say how much the different products received funding from the government. So that's direct financial, basically financial aid from public sector. So of course, as Greens, we went overboard, and we also added philanthropies, indirect funding such as tax breaks and so on. So we do support the notion that the Commission put there. But I mean, if you just say governmental grants, it's really very partial proportion of the entire picture. So we need more. And also we added another article on when you're going for pricing and reimbursement, also if the authorities ask, you should disclose your R&D costs. So we would also like to add that there. If you look at the other side, and that's the model that I've never been too convinced about, is the value-based pricing model, which I think is not a value-based pricing model at the moment. It's more how much am I going to get in different countries? So what's the ability to pay of different countries? So that one, of course, is very praised by the industry. And that's where we are actually responsible for the evidence generation at the EU level, because you have in the directive and the regulation, we are putting requirements for marketing authorizations that are also very important than if you do HTA, and then important because, of course, you're not going to redo trials. So you'd use the same data essentially for HTA and then for pricing and reimbursement. And then what are we trying to do at the EU level? And we will see if this flies or not, because of course we are in the midst of negotiations. We don't know about the majorities, but what, as the Greens, we are really trying to make comparative trials, for instance, kind of the standard. And then of course, if you cannot use an active comparator, you can justify why it's not appropriate, and that's all fine. But we do need to address the evidence gaps. And we do have a lot of new drugs marketed based on limited evidence, surrogate data. We do not actually know the added value, but we do certainly use the added value. We say it's a breakthrough when we're actually doing the pricing. And then, of course, fair price is also linked to whether or not, or price generally and affordability is linked to whether or not you actually have competitors. It's a regular market, so it really depends. Do you have a monopoly or not? If you do have a monopoly, of course, prices are way higher. And this legislation package is very heavy in terms of the IP and the protection for regulatory data and also market protection. And Javier said it, open science is the key. But of course, when it comes to the detail, we can put, open science, we can put this in Horizon when we really are seeing, we invest the money in this research project, we want the data to be available. It's way more difficult if we are actually regulating pharmaceuticals, where it's mostly company data. We have it enlarged now, but it's mostly company data. And then, of course, everyone is screaming for more and more protection, and it's the exact opposite. We are not doing open science. We are protecting the data, and we are limiting access to the research results for a really long time. which of course in the long term affects affordability of medicines.
Thank you, and also for giving us some insight into the sort of inner workings of how things are done in the Parliament, some of the challenges. And before I get some reflection from the audience, I wonder if I could come back to you. You know, you have this calculator, and it will be really interesting to understand how's it been used. How's it been applied? Can you give us an example? Has it resulted in better negotiations, differences in pricing, and where do you go with this tool next? You already mentioned, look, there are some pieces in there that we had to plug in and we don't know. Are you enhancing it, developing it? Is there a version 2 coming?
So the calculator is the application, the technical tool of the model. So the key element is the model. The model has been used, sadly enough, only once by a brave minister of health, which is in the Netherlands, because I think most of the minister of health in the Netherlands really dare doing things that many ministers would never dare doing, and they use this model to assess the price of a repurposed drug, which is a Namuscla, and they refused the reimbursement based on that cost. So it's a first practical use of the calculator, which we are very happy about. We are trying to push, and in Belgium we have a campaign, Solidaris, my mutual fund. We have a campaign, and we would like to introduce in the law, in the legislation, that this calculation should be one element in the file to discuss the price. So it's not a decision element, but it's an information element. And at the moment, we know that the companies are using really anchor prices with very, very high prices. So you don't dare asking for a 75% discount, because who would ask for that? But if you know that the price is 90% lower, then maybe you will dare more to ask this. So this is what we are asking at the Belgian level. But we know that this model has been conceived as a European model, because as Sarah explained, I mean, in WHO Europe, we are 900 million inhabitants. In Europe, we are more than 400 million. It's more than in the United States. And that's the only way we can really push and obtain this kind of models of very lower prices, but for a very a much increased volume. And that's a very key element in the model, is that what we want is more access, meaning lower prices, so that all European countries can have access to the same drugs. And that's really a key element for the companies also, that the revenues that they will lose because the prices will be much lower, they will get back in volume, and we will get much more as Europeans, because we will get much more health with those added volume.
So I'm really intrigued by our brave Dutch minister. So reimbursement was refused, and then what happened? Did the company change their pricing, or did they come up with something different, or was that it? Buff, gone.
They never come back with different prices. I mean, that's their price. If you don't want their price, you just don't get the drug. That's it. I mean, there is no way you can have.
So it's a very unbalanced power dynamic.
Totally, and that's why we need to restore it and to act as Europeans, and then we are even stronger than America. I mean, then we can really start discussing. And there are very interesting things also for the companies in there, because in the development of drugs at the moment, there are less and less certainties. We really have huge problems with that. I mean, these accelerated pathways with drugs coming with lots of uncertainties for us, but also for the companies, because the companies can't know now how much they can expect as a price for those drugs. And in this kind of model with objective parameters, they will have also a much more predictable revenue and a much more predictable future. And the same for the payers, of course, because then we can also prepare for some new drugs and some new costs.
Thank you. I'm going to invite reflections, comments, questions from the floor. Yes, we will bring you a microphone. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wilbert Bannenberg. I'm from the Netherlands. I was involved in that case of Maxilitine. Yeah, my question is actually, can we use the law actually to fight excessive pricing and to get fair pricing? So our organization was created 5 years ago. We presented here in the same EU Alliance meeting about the the case of CDCA Lidient and also the Maxilitine case. After 3 years, we finally got the company fined in 4 countries, a total of 35 million euros for making misuse of their economic power. And now we've actually taken to court the biggest product before Corona, which is Humira from AbbVie. They sold 208 billion, not million, billion dollars worth of that product. From a congressional hearing from Bernie Sanders in the US, we know that they claim they used 11% for R&D and 11% for the costs of production. So then we granted them a fair price profit of 25%, which is, I think, a bit high, but this means that there is 53% excess profit. And in my country, Netherlands, that means 1.2 billion euros. And all that money has been taken from our public health budget and actually displaced healthcare with 16,300 qualis. That means 16,300 people die now a year too early because of that profit. Each person in the Netherlands paid 68 euros to the profit. Now, the question is, what will the court say about this? They will take 5 years, and it costs also a lot of money. We use tort, and we use misuse of economic power. That's competition law, and also human rights is not yet a law that's binding for the companies, but we hope to actually apply that. What we then want is first transparency. Legislation like Italy has introduced it after the double show 2019 decision. Then we want the fair pricing data to be included compulsory in the dossier to the Health Technology Agency. And then finally, we want the human rights be actually legally enforceable for companies, and that can be done through another law. Actually, we'd like to discuss this with others. So if there's other NGOs in Europe who wants to join us, we can create Pharmaceutical Accountability Europe. And we already have the Belgium counterparts of Pharma to Justice. They've already started. They're in the news today in Belgium. So, well, this was not really a question, but a question for we need to take more action.
Thank you very much. I see I have a couple of hands as well. One at the back, yes. And then I think, go ahead.
Thank you for such an insightful engagement and presentation. First of all, I want to make a quick recap of what I saw in one of the presentations. It says transparency on total R&D equals prerequisites for fair pricing. I mean, it's obvious. If we don't know what the costs of the investments, then, I mean, we could not be negotiating to get fair prices. But the other question I have, which is for Dr. Javier, is this not an urgent time for us in Europe to have the EU recognize that the value of transparency of data to be in the values that we so there hold ourselves to? And if that's the case, I mean, is it not time to, for instance, involve or make a case to the EU court to ensure that, I mean, this becomes a vital component for transparency? Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. There's a question. You've got a target of the Supreme Court in Spain 5 years from now. You're being invited to say, you know, should we be aiming for Luxembourg, for the European Court of Justice, and in which case, access to data? What's our legal mechanism?
The answer to that question would need several PhD dissertations. So, and I'm not able to do so, but I would just give some clues. We do have a problem with data nowadays. And the problem with data is an imbalanced world where the data belongs to 2, 3, or 4 companies. And these companies are not European. We all know who these companies are. What we're speaking about is how should we balance, how should we design a new world where the three powers, legislature, executive, and and Parliament would be and judiciary, sorry, would have their differences and their balance, because we live now in a different digital era where what we have to do is we have to rebalance the system, because now you have seen Elon Musk going to Israel and he has become as if he was the president of the United States. So the companies who own the data nowadays are the ones who exercise their power. So the question should be gone to an upper level, and we should begin to rethink how is the data world working, because Google has more biogenetics data than any university in the world. Why? Because their researchers, they share that data in Google Drive. And that is now being tailored by artificial intelligence. And then the information is being extracted for a private purpose that is not shared with the public. And it's obtained from the public. One example, Spanish universities, they use Google Drive and they use Gmail. And who doesn't have friends with Gmail? I don't have Gmail, but my problem is my relationships with people, 50% are with people who have a Gmail account. Therefore, my emails are not secret, are under email inspection of Google. And if it's not Google, it's Teams. And it's not Teams, it's Threads. And then it's not that, it's Twitter. So the problem is that the data nowadays does not belong to us, is in hands of private companies. And that is not used in order to scientific research, but they do hold it. Should we push for European regulations saying you have to disclose that information? The information that you obtain from European citizens must come back to our hands. And this hands is public hands, public institutions, and here in Europe. And you're going to pay a tax for that, because you are obtaining our data. You're making profit with that data, and you are not giving us anything back. And it's not about intellectual property. It's about our privacy rights and our behavior, because inspecting our behavior, there are two results. First one is what we're going to consume, and second, how we're going to think in order to do political decisions. And for me, that is the main question and the problem that we have to resolve in 50 or 100 years. Or I'm going more than 4 or 5, okay?
Thank you. I love your long-term thinking. It's so refreshing to hear. And I'm going to invite you to also reflect on this. And also, I'm wondering, at the same time, we're envisioning a European health data space where we are encouraging people to share, to share and opt in. In fact, they had a political agreement just 2 nights ago on the council position on the European health data space. So on the one hand, we're saying share your health data in order to build science, to generate new scientific knowledge, and yes, if you've got a specific disease, but we also need everyone else for comparators to move the science forward. And at the same time, I'm wondering, can we use that angle to say, in order to access and benefit from more transparency of data, you must also be more transparent about how you spend it? Fantasy idea, but let's see.
Yes, complex question, and even more complex answer to it. So first, I would just like to answer from the audience about the how do we use the law and how do we take it on in Luxembourg? And we've done it on as Greens on the vaccine contract, because we have actually sued the Commission for not fully disclosing the vaccine contracts for COVID. And it's been 3 years that we are in proceedings with the Commission. We had a hearing, the last hearing about a month and a half ago. We are still waiting for the results. If we do win, it's going to be a game changer, because it will be the first case law for overriding public interest. And we actually do have currently the financial regulation where everyone likes to quote it, which in theory tells that, companies are entitled to have their commercially confidential information redacted when we're publishing documents. And at the end, on the other side, it also says, well, but there is an overriding public interest for disclosure. But how do we actually interpret the overriding public interest is absolutely up to the court. So we have no case law on this. And so if we do win, and we said, look, if you are not going to use the overriding public interest argument during the biggest pandemic, then when are you actually going to use it? It would be, otherwise it's just a redundant clause that we like to put in recitals in the regulations, because we don't have a majority to put it in articles, let me tell you that. So on the we will see, but it's a big result to come, and it will be a, and yes, we do need to use the law more. In theory, they should be the only ones that are not like politically charged in a way. So on the health data space, it's actually interesting, because we talked about the open science and how we should share results, and of course individuals are now invited to. I'm not going to go in the debate over opt-ins, opt-outs, because it's a headache, but individuals are now sort of invited to, or obliged, if they don't understand the system, to share their health data for research purposes and for decision making. But you know, everybody wanted to be a data user in the EHDS. Everybody wanted to ask for a permit and then use the data in the data space for their own thing. Nobody wanted to be a data holder. Nobody wanted to make the data available for secondary use. So especially the companies, they try to get out of it. It is still in that they are data holders. But of course, we have now in the parliament's position this Article 33A, and yes, it's going to stay after the plenary, that is really even saying that if the governments don't know how to redact confidential information, they should just not share the data, which is absolutely ridiculous. And it's the way it is. I mean, the industry absolutely freaked out that the health data space would mean an open science on everything. It would need an open science on the results of the research that the health data space helped generate. But it definitely would not mean an open science of all the different data that we have in Europe. Not the patient data, not the company data, not the other research data.
Okay, thank you. Do I have, yes, please go ahead. I'll bring the microphone here. If I have a chance, I'll come back to you. I just need to see if there's anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question who'd like to say something. Yes, go ahead, Dimitri.
Yeah, I have particularly a question to the professor.
Yes.
Because there have been recent cases in South Africa, also in Colombia, where contracts for COVID-19 vaccines were published in the end after court cases, where the case was made that these could not be trade secrets, and there was clearly overriding public interest. So I'm wondering, to what extent, from a legal perspective, this helps your case, or is it completely separate? Do these arguments help you in any way? And a bit in relation to that, with regards to the pharmaceutical legislation more generally, you know, the argument is often brought up, indeed, that it's, you know, confidential information, etc. You know, how do you look at that in terms of the concerns that are being brought up there? To what extent this could, but to what extent it could be a concern to implement some of the proposals that are on the table right now?
Yes, that's. I think you're the professor. Yes.
Yeah. Well, doctor. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I would never reach the position of professor. I would always remain in low levels.
I want to insult you by calling you the lawyer on the panel.
Yeah, the lawyer, the activist, the philosopher. I've got plenty of hats. But well, I feel comfortable with all of them. And first of all, thank you for letting me explaining myself here. It helps. Everything helps. There's one argument that they always pose there, which is intellectual property. But intellectual property is not solid rock. Intellectual property must be granulated, and it's got the granularity of intellectual property. We had the opportunity, Eva Mendez and me, and she was the co-chair of the Open Science Group in the European Union. We wrote a report for the European Commission speaking about analyzing the relationships between the open science and the intellectual property rights. And our considerations were very, very interesting because, first of all, intellectual property is not this solid rock, and we need to distinguish at least four main fields of intellectual property. The first one is copyright, which is not applicable to drugs. Okay, copyright here has got nothing to do. It's got to do with patents, but patents, one of the requirements of the patents are that you have to disclose the information in order to demonstrate that they are innovative. If there is no innovation, then you cannot have a patent there, even though you're going to trick it. Yes, they're going to cheat in that some sense because they're going to change aspirin for something that is called nothing nowadays in a different way. but it's exactly the same thing, but they just change a tiny detail so they can have this monopoly for another 5 or 15 years. Okay, so patents, they are really applicable. The third is trademarks. Trademarks is just a linguistic reference from one reality to a symbol or to a logo. And the fourth one is trade secrets. But when we're speaking about health, trade secrets should not be applicable here. So when we are speaking, because, okay, we have to know what we are putting inside our body. So our first right is the human integrity, and that's a human right. So you're not going to do trade secrets when you come to drugs. So when we speak about intellectual property, in the end, it is not applicable, because the only one that could be applicable that are patents are, well, per se transparent. Therefore, the argumentation of intellectual property should be put out of the table. What we should put over the table are trade competition conditions. Well, that's okay. And if you want that the price will remain, or the conditions, or those key those key indicators remain secret in order to obtain a better price, then that is not a trade secret under an intellectual property concept. That is just maintaining secret your certain conditions that will not allow the others to be good competitors. And I think that sometimes what we need to bring is things to the reality. And what do I mean by that? And it's not to be demagogic, but it's going to speak about sociology of science and philosophy of science. The sociology of science would begin with, what are you doing with a conference in Las Vegas? Because who is paying for that? The consumer. And is this research and development? So you've got here certain costs of your activities. And how can we expect seriousness in a company where more of the budget goes in marketing? That's another point that we should then understand. If we are going to analyze all what's in a price, we're going to analyze all your activities. And the activities that you are maintaining, excuse me, they should not include champagne and prostitutes. Because
have you? Yes.
Because that is what happens. True is. There was a strong opposition in Spain into a law that obliged them to disclose what doctors were the ones that were invited to what events. And the doctors had to disclose what did they receive from the pharma industry. This is not serious. Okay. And that was opposed for that. So in the end, we enter into discussions, and of course, we should not be like the mirror, but what we have to do is we have to speak sometimes about sociology of science. And if we are academics, if we are scholars, we have to include in the discussions all those sorts of things, because that also affect. Because if not, what we're going to lose is our vision. And our vision, yes, the key indicators, the parameters, etc., yes. But what about the reality? We're humans. What's going on? And again, the elephant in the room, political corruption. Always is political corruption. How can we study political corruption? Because it's not normal what you presented about Gilead case. So how many billions and what was the revenue? That is not normal. That is a financial aspect. And that is paying wills.
Javier, I think you've brought us to the end of our time, and you've taken us through a huge journey and inviting us to really reflect on why are we all here and what is all this about? And I think there's a couple of little elements that I'd like to draw from our conversation. We started our conversation to say, you know, what governments want, their public policy is they want fair prices. They want a pharmaceutical industry producing drugs. They want to meet patient needs, and they've got to be able to maintain their healthcare system because they're managing public money. So fair pricing was the goal. And in order to do that, we heard from Anne, you know, you have to have a model. You've got to understand what is a fair pricing. And we focused on the transparency of R&D costs. And we used some interesting data from the research that the OECD has done, which is at early stages because the report has just come forward. We then moved on sort of philosophically to the issue of, in a way, there's two different issues. The first is did it actually cost the R&D to develop this end drug? And then there's a second thing around transparency around pricing, is that we recognize that this, perhaps unlike many other industries, involves lots of failures. Not everything gets to the end. So it isn't as simple as saying, here's your R&D costs, give you a reasonable profit, and that's the end, because there are other things that need to be taken into account. And there's sort of these two forms of transparency. There's transparency on the R&D costs, and then there's transparency on pricing. And in some of the cases that you took sort of make that link, but I feel that's a conversation we still need to explore in a little bit more detail. But can we say a warm thank you to our panel for having shared such a wonderful session?